Part 2 of Story 19 of Lucy Maud Montgomery's Short Stories, 1902 to 1903. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Lucy Maud Montgomery's Short Stories, 1902 to 1903, by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Story 19. The Running Away of Chester. Part 2. In the Mount Hope kitchen, Miss Salome was at that moment deep in discussion with her help over the weighty question of how the damsons were to be preserved. Miss Salome wanted them boiled. Clementine Bosworth, the help, insisted that they ought to be baked. Clementine was always very positive. She had bossed Miss Salome for years, and both knew that in the end the damsons would be baked, but the argument had to be carried out for dignity's sake. "They're so sour when they're baked," protested Miss Salome. "Well, you don't want damsons sweet, do you?" retorted Clementine scornfully. "That's the beauty of damsons, their tartness. And they keep ever so much better baked, Salome, you know they do. My grandmother always baked hers, and they would keep for 3 years." Miss Salome knew that when Clementine dragged her grandmother into the question, it was time to surrender. Beyond that, dignity degenerated into stubbornness. It would be useless to say that she did not want to keep her damsons for 3 years, and that she was content to eat them up and trust to Providence for the next year's supply. "Well, well, bake them then," she said placidly. "I don't suppose it makes much difference one way or another. Only, I insist. What was that noise, Clementine? It sounded like something falling against the porch door." "It's that worthless dog of Martin's, I suppose," said Clementine, grasping a broom-handle with a grimness that boded ill for the dog. "Mussing up my clean doorstep with his dirty paws again. I'll fix him." Clementine swept out through the porch and jerked open the door. There was a moment's silence. Then Miss Salome heard her say, "For the land's sake, Salome Whitney, come here." What Miss Salome saw when she hurried out was a white-faced boy stretched on the doorstep at Clementine's feet. "Is he dead?" she gasped. "Dead? No," sniffed Clementine. "He's fainted, that's what he is. Where on earth did he come from? He ain't a Hopedale boy." "He must be carried right in," exclaimed Miss Salome in distress. "Why, he may die there. He must be very ill." "Looks more to me as if he had fainted from sheer starvation," returned Clementine brusquely as she picked him up in her lean, muscular arms. "Why, he's skin and bone. He ain't hardly heavier than a baby. Well, this is a mysterious piece of work. Where'll I put him?" "Lay him on the sofa," said Miss Salome as soon as she had recovered from the horror into which Clementine's starvation dictum had thrown her. "A child starving to death on her doorstep! What do you do for people in a faint, Clementine?" "Wet their face, and h'ist up their feet, and loosen their collar," said Clementine in a succession of jerks, doing each thing as she mentioned it. "And hold ammonia to their nose. Run for the ammonia, Salome. Look, will you, skin and bone!" But Miss Salome had gone for the ammonia. There was a look on the boy's thin, pallid face that tugged painfully at her heartstrings. When Chester came back to consciousness with the pungency of the ammonia reeking through his head, he found himself lying on very soft pillows in a very big, white, sunny kitchen, where everything was scoured to a brightness that dazzled you. Bending over him was a tall, gaunt woman with a thin, determined face and snapping black eyes, and standing beside her with a steaming bowl in her hand was the nice, rosy lady who had given him the taffy on the boat. When he opened his eyes, Miss Salome knew him. "Why, it's the little boy I saw on the boat!" she exclaimed. "Well, you've come to," said Clementine, eyeing Chester severely, "and now perhaps you'll explain what you mean by fainting away on doorsteps and scaring people out of their senses." Chester thought that this must be the mistress of Mount Hope Farm, and hastened to propitiate her. "I'm sorry," he faltered feebly. "I didn't mean to. "You're not to do any talking until you've had something to eat," snapped Clementine inconsistently. "Here, open your mouth and take this broth. Pretty doings, I say." Clementine spoke as sharply as Aunt Harriet had ever done, but somehow or other Chester did not feel afraid of her and her black eyes. She sat down by his side and fed him from the bowl of hot broth with a deft gentleness oddly in contrast with her grim expression. Chester thought he had never in all his life tasted anything so good as that broth. The boy was really almost starved. He drank every drop of it. Clementine gave a grunt of satisfaction as she handed the empty bowl and spoon to the silent, smiling Miss Salome. "Now, who are you, and what do you want?" she said. Chester had been expecting this question, and while coming along the Hopedale road he had thought out an answer to it. He began now, speaking the words slowly and gaspingly, as if reciting a hastily learned lesson. "My name is Chester Benson. I belong to Upton up the country. My folks are dead, and I came to Montrose to look for work. I've been there a week, and I couldn't get anything to do. I heard a man say that you wanted men to help in the harvest, so I came out to see if you'd hire me." In spite of his weakness, Chester's face turned very red before he got to the end of his speech. He was new to deception. To be sure, there was not, strictly speaking, an untrue word in it. As for his name, it was Chester Benson Stevens, but for all that, Chester could not have felt or looked more guilty if he had been telling an out-and-out falsehood at every breath. "Humph!" said Clementine in a dissatisfied tone. "What on earth do you suppose a midget like you can do in the harvest field? And we don't want any more help anyway. We've got enough." Chester grew sick with disappointment, but at this moment Miss Salome spoke up. "No, we haven't, Clementine. We want another hand, and I'll hire you, Chester. That's your name, isn't it? I'll give you good wages, too." "Now, Salome," protested Clementine. But Miss Salome only said, "I've made up my mind, Clementine." Clementine knew that when Miss Salome did make up her mind and announced it in that quiet, very unmistakable tone, she was mistress of the situation and intended to remain so. "Oh, very well," she retorted. "You'll please yourself, Salome, of course. I think it would be wiser to wait until you found out a little more about him." "And have him starving on people's doorsteps in the meantime?" questioned Miss Salome severely. "Well," returned Clementine, with the air of one who washes her hands of a doubtful proposition, "don't blame me if you repent of it." By this time Chester had grasped the wonderful fact that his troubles were ended, for a while at least. He raised himself up on one arm and looked gratefully at Miss Salome. "Thank you," he said. "I'll work hard. I'm used to doing a lot." "There, there," said Miss Salome, patting his shoulder gently. "Lie down and rest. Dinner will be ready soon, and I guess you'll be ready for it." To Clementine she added in a low, gentle tone, "There's a look on his face that reminded me of Johnny. It came out so strong when he sat up just now that it made me feel like crying. Don't you notice it, Clementine?" "Can't say that I do," replied that energetic person, who was flying about the kitchen with a speed that made Chester's head dizzy, trying to follow her with his eyes. "All I can see is freckles and bones, but if you're satisfied, I am. For law's sake, don't fluster me, Salome. There's 101 things to be done out of hand. This frolic has clean dundered the whole forenoon's work." After dinner Chester decided that it was time to make himself useful. "Can I go right to work now?" he asked. "We don't begin harvest till tomorrow," said Miss Salome. "You'd better rest this afternoon." "Oh, I'm all right now," insisted Chester. "I feel fine. Please give me something to do." "You can go out and cut me some wood for my afternoon's baking," said Clementine, "and see you cut it short enough. Any other boy that's tried always gets it about 2 inches too long." When he had gone out, she said scornfully to Miss Salome, "Well, what do you expect that size to accomplish in a harvest field, Salome Whitney?" "Not very much, perhaps," said Miss Salome mildly. "But what could I do? You wouldn't have me turn the child adrift on the world again, would you, Clementine?" Clementine did not choose to answer this appeal. She rattled her dishes noisily in the dishpan. "Well, where are you going to put him to sleep?" she demanded. "The hands you've got will fill the kitchen chamber. There's only the spare room left. You'd hardly put him there, I suppose. Your philanthropy will hardly lead you as far as that." When Clementine employed big words and sarcasm at the same time, the effect was tremendous, but Miss Salome didn't wilt. "What makes you so prejudiced against him?" she asked curiously. "I'm not prejudiced against him, but that story about himself didn't ring true. I worked in Upton years ago, and there weren't any Bensons there then. There's more behind that he hasn't told. I'd find out what it was before I took him into my house, that's all. But I'm not prejudiced." "Well, well," said Miss Salome soothingly, "we must do the best we can for him. It's a sort of duty. And as for a room for him, why, I'll put him in Johnny's." Clementine opened her mouth and shut it again. She understood that it would be a waste of breath to say anything more. If Miss Salome had made up her mind to put this freckled, determined-looking waif, dropped on her doorstep from heaven knew where, into Johnny's room, that was an end of the matter. "But I'll not be surprised at anything after this," she muttered as she carried her dishes into the pantry. "First a skinny little urchin goes and faints on her doorstep. Then she hires him and puts him in Johnny's room. Johnny's room! Salome Whitney, what do you mean?" Perhaps Miss Salome hardly knew what she meant, but somehow her heart went out warmly to this boy. In spite of Clementine's sniffs, she held to the opinion that he looked like Johnny. Johnny was a little nephew of hers. She had taken him to bring up when his parents died, and she had loved him very dearly. He had died 4 years ago, and since that time the little front room over the front porch had never been occupied. It was just as Johnny had left it. Beyond keeping it scrupulously clean, Miss Salome never allowed it to be disturbed. And now a somewhat ragged lad from nowhere was to be put into it. No wonder Clementine shook her head when Miss Salome went up to air it. Even Clementine had to admit that Chester was willing to work. He split wood until she called him to stop. Then he carried in the wood-box-full and piled it so neatly that even the grim handmaiden was pleased. After that she sent him to the garden to pick the early beans. In the evening he milked 3 cows and did all the chores, falling into the ways of the place with a deft adaptability that went far to soften Clementine's heart. "He's been taught to work somewheres," she admitted grudgingly, "and he's real polite and respectful, but he looks too cute by half, and his name isn't Benson any more than mine. When I called him Chester Benson out there in the cow-yard, he stared at me for half a minute as if I'd called him Nebuchadnezzar." When bedtime came, Miss Salome took Chester up to a room whose whiteness and daintiness quite took away the breath of a lad who had been used to sleeping in garrets or hired men's kitchen chambers all his life. Later on Miss Salome came in to see if he was comfortable, and stood with her candle in her hand, looking down very kindly at the thin, shrewd little face on the pillow. "I hope you'll sleep real well here, Chester," she said. "I had a little boy once who used to sleep here. You look like him. Good night." She bent over him and kissed his forehead. Chester had never been kissed by anyone before, as far as he could remember. Something came up in his throat that felt about as big as a pumpkin. At the same moment he wished he could have told Miss Salome the whole truth about himself. I might tell her in the morning, he thought, as he watched her figure passing out of the little porch chamber. But on second thought he decided that this would never do. He felt sure she would disapprove of his running away, and would probably insist upon his going straight back to Upton, or at least informing Aunt Harriet of his whereabouts. No, he could not tell her. Clementine was an early riser, but when she came into the kitchen the next morning the fire was already made, and Chester was out in the yard with 3 of the 5 cows milked. "Humph," said Clementine amiably. "New brooms sweep clean." But she gave him cream with his porridge that morning. Generally, all Miss Salome's hired hands got from Clementine was skim milk. Miss Salome's regular hired man lived in a little house down the hollow. He soon turned up, and the other 2 men she had hired for the harvest also arrived. Martin, the man, looked Chester over quizzically. "What do you think you can do, sonny?" "Anything," said Chester sturdily. "I'm used to work." "He's right," whispered Clementine aside. "He's smart as a steel trap, but just you keep an eye on him all the same, Martin." Chester soon proved his mettle in the harvest field. In the brisk 3 weeks that followed, even Clementine had to admit that he earned every cent of his wages. His active feet were untiring, and his wiry arms could pitch and stalk with the best. When the day's work was ended, he brought in wood and water for Clementine, helped milk the cows, gathered the eggs, and made on his own responsibility a round of barns and outhouses to make sure that everything was snug and tight for the night. "Freckles and Bones has been well trained somewhere," said Clementine again. It was hardly fair to put the bones in now, for Chester was growing plump and hearty. He had never been so happy in his life. Upton drudgery and that dreadful week in Montrose seemed like a bad dream. Here, in the golden meadows of Mount Hope Farm, he worked with a right good will. The men liked him, and he soon became a favorite with them. Even Clementine relented somewhat. To be sure, she continued very grim, and still threw her words at him as if they were so many missiles warranted to strike home, but Chester soon learned that Clementine's bark was worse than her bite. She was really very good to him and fed him lavishly, but she declared that this was only to put some flesh on him. "It offends me to see bones sticking through anybody's skin like that. We aren't used to such objects at Mount Hope Farm, thank goodness. Yes, you may smile, Salome, I like him well enough, and I'll admit that he knows how to make himself useful, but I don't trust him any more than ever I did. He's mighty close about his past life. You can't get any more out of him than juice out of a post. I've tried, and I know." But it was Miss Salome who had won Chester's whole heart. He had never loved anybody in his hard little life before. He loved her with an almost dog-like devotion. He forgot that he was working to earn money and make his fortune. He worked to please Miss Salome. She was good and kind and gentle to him, and his starved heart thawed and expanded in the sunshine of her atmosphere. She went to the little porch-room every night to kiss him good night. Chester would have been bitterly disappointed if she had failed to go. She was greatly shocked to find out that he had never said his prayers before going to bed. She insisted on teaching him the simple little one she had used herself when a child. When Chester found that it would please her, he said it every night. There was nothing he would not have done for Miss Salome. She talked a good deal to him about Johnny, and she gave him the jackknife that Johnny had owned. "It belonged to a good, manly little boy once," she said, "and now I hope it belongs to another such." "I ain't very good," said Chester repentantly, "but I'll try to be, Miss Salome. Honest I will." One day he heard Miss Salome speaking of someone who had run away from home. A wicked, ungrateful boy, she called him. Chester blushed until his freckles were drowned out in a sea of red, and Clementine saw it, of course. When did anything ever escape those merciless black eyes of Clementine's? "Do you think it's always wrong for a fellow to run away, Miss Salome?" he faltered. "It can't ever be right," said Miss Salome decidedly. "But if he wasn't treated well, and was jawed at, and not let to go to school?" pleaded Chester. Clementine gave Miss Salome a look as of one who would say, "You're bat blind if you can't read between the lines of that," but Miss Salome was placidly unconscious. She was not really thinking of the subject at all, and did not guess that Chester meant anything more than generalities. "Not even then," she said firmly. "Nothing can justify a boy for running away, especially as Jarvis Coleman did, never even left a word behind him to say where he'd gone. His aunt thought he'd fallen into the river." "Don't suppose she would have grieved much if he had," said Clementine sarcastically, all the while watching Chester until he felt as if she were boring into his very soul and reading all his past life. When the harvest season drew to a close, dismay crept into the soul of our hero. Where would he go now? He hated to think of leaving Mount Hope Farm and Miss Salome. He would have been content to stay there and work as hard as he had ever worked at Upton, merely for the roof over his head and the food he ate. The making of a fortune seemed a small thing compared to the privilege of being near Miss Salome. "But I suppose I must just up and go," he muttered dolefully. One day Miss Salome had a conference with Clementine. At the end of it the latter said, "Do as you please," in the tone she might have used to a spoiled child. "But if you'd take my advice, which you won't and never do, you'd write to somebody in Upton and make inquiries about him first. What he says is all well, and he sticks to it marvellous, and there's no tripping him up. But there's something behind, Salome Whitney. Mark my words, there's something behind." "He looks so like Johnny," said Miss Salome wistfully. "And I suppose you think that covers a multitude of sins," said Clementine contemptuously. End of Part 2 of The Running Away of Chester. This story continues in Part 3.